On the 8th of August 1944, near Senth, south of the town of Caen in Normandy, France, the air was thick with the sound of artillery and tank engines. Captain Michael Whitman, the commander of the famed Tiger 007, sat in the cupola of his massive tank, his fingers tightening around the grip of his binoculars. The creaking of his gloves barely registered over the chaos of the battlefield. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the crushing realization that had been slowly growing since dawn. The Allies were relentless. For the past 3 hours, his unit of 4 Tiger tanks had been systematically obliterating the enemy's Sherman tanks, with 27 burning wrecks scattered across the fields. Each of his Tigers had accounted for at least 6 kills, and by all conventional metrics of warfare, they were winning the battle decisively. The kill-to-loss ratio was extraordinary, nearing 7-1 in favor of the Germans. Yet as Whitman looked through his binoculars, he could see that victory was slipping from his grasp. Ahead of him, 48 more Shermans appeared, advancing from 3 different directions, their crews fresh and eager, their ammunition fully stocked. Behind them, columns of dust suggested that even more were on the way. His Tigers had only 12 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition left between them, and with no fuel for any significant maneuvering, Whitman realized that his tanks could no longer hold their ground. Worse yet, there were no reinforcements in sight. The raw mathematics of industrial warfare were playing out before his eyes, and no matter how skilled his crew or how powerful their tanks, it was clear that the tide was shifting toward overwhelming numbers. At this moment, Whitman understood something that would be realized by every German tank commander in the coming years. What they were witnessing wasn't a battle, but the unstoppable force of industrial production. The Germans, despite their tactical brilliance, could not match the sheer volume of tanks the Allies were able to produce. It was only a matter of time before the German forces were crushed beneath the weight of Allied manufacturing power. Within minutes, Whitman's tank would be destroyed, likely by a Sherman Firefly or Canadian forces, as historians have debated the exact circumstances of his death. His last transmission, sent at 12:47 hours, captured the desperation of the moment. Ammunition exhausted, enemy unlimited. The story of the Tiger tank's dominance on the battlefield began on May 26, 1941, in the mountains of Berchtesgaden at Hitler's retreat. There, Ferdinand Porsche and Henschel & Son presented their designs for what would become the Tiger tank. Hitler, in awe of its massive 88mm gun and nearly impenetrable armor, immediately ordered its production. He told his generals that this tank would be worth a whole battalion, that one Tiger would be able to destroy a dozen enemy vehicles. This belief set the stage for a fatal miscalculation. The German high command was convinced that quality would always triumph over quantity. They believed that the technological superiority of the Tiger tank, its advanced engineering, powerful gun, and nearly impenetrable armor would ensure victory. The Germans were confident that the Allies could never match the excellence of their engineering. The American tanks, in the eyes of Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, were merely Detroit tin cans on tracks. The first Tiger tank rolled off the production line on August 4, 1942, at the Henschel factory in Kassel, after 300,000 man-hours had been invested in its construction. The tank was a masterpiece of precision engineering, with 26,000 individual parts, hand-fitted transmissions, and meticulously welded armor. The design of its interleaved wheels, which helped distribute the tank's immense 57-ton weight, required such precise assembly that only the most skilled workers could handle it. The first trials of the Tiger, held at Kumdorf, were promising. Wolfgang Tamala, who oversaw the tests, wrote in his report that the Tiger was the pinnacle of German engineering, capable of defeating any enemy. He believed that if they could produce 100 Tigers per month, Germany would win the war. However, reality soon set in. The highest production achieved was 104 Tigers in April 1944, 2 years after its introduction. Meanwhile, American factories were cranking out 2,000 Sherman tanks every month. The story of the American tank production effort began not in a military strategy meeting, but with a phone call.
On May 28, 1940, William Cuddenson, a former president of General Motors, received a call from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. "Bill," Roosevelt said, "I want you to come to Washington. We need to build 50,000 planes and 50,000 tanks." Cuddinson's response would set the course for the massive industrial effort that would turn the tide of the war. His answer marked the beginning of an approach to tank production that would value quantity above all else. In the face of such overwhelming numbers, the German tanks, no matter how advanced, were doomed. The philosophy behind the design of the Sherman tank stemmed from a pragmatic approach to mass production rather than perfection. On August 31, 1940, at a meeting held at Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground, officials presented a vision for a tank that was simple enough for untrained workers to produce, yet capable of being mass-produced at a scale the Germans could not match. Army ordnance officials outlined a set of specifications that would have caused traditional military engineers to cringe, but delighted industrialists from Detroit. The tank had to be easy to assemble, with interchangeable parts that could be built by a workforce with minimal experience. It would use an engine that could run on various types of fuel, and its armor would be welded, not precision-fitted. The tracks had to be replaced by the tank's crew in the field, and the turret ring needed to be wide enough to accommodate future upgrades. Major General Gladian Barnes, who headed Army Ordnance, emphasized a key directive to the contractors. "We don't need the perfect tank, just a good enough one. We need to be able to produce 100 tanks for every 100 the Germans build. Make it reliable, easy to repair, and build it in large numbers." This directive reflected a stark contrast to the German approach to tank production. At the Henschel factory in Germany, workers toiled in a highly specialized, craftsmanship-based environment. The factory resembled a medieval guild more than a modern industrial space. Highly skilled artisans, some of whom had honed their craft over many years, meticulously crafted each part. Each tank was essentially built by hand, with workers taking great pride in their craftsmanship. Former worker Fritz Lehart, who worked in the Henschel factory before being drafted into the military, later recalled the painstaking process. "We spent 3 whole days just on the final drive assembly. Each gear was measured with micrometers, and every weld was inspected several times. We painted the identification numbers by hand. It wasn't mass production, it was more like making art."
In stark contrast, the Detroit Tank Arsenal, operated by Chrysler and opened on September 15, 1941, embraced the industrialization of tank production. The plant itself was massive, covering over 1.25 million square feet, which was more than the combined area of all German tank factories. Instead of skilled craftsmen, the workforce at Detroit consisted of a diverse group of individuals, including former auto workers, housewives, teenagers, and anyone who could learn basic factory tasks like operating riveting guns or welding torches. The legendary Rosie the Riveter, Rose Willell Monroe, worked on the assembly line in the Detroit plant, where she recalled, "I had never seen a tank before I started working on them. They gave us just 2 days of training, and then we were put to work. Everything was broken down into simple steps. I would weld one seam, and then the tank would move on to someone else who welded the next one. We could finish a tank in just 4 hours. The Detroit Arsenal introduced the concept of assembly line tank production, a feat that German engineers at the time believed to be impossible. Drawing from the techniques used in automobile manufacturing, Chrysler engineers broke the tank down into modular components, which were produced on parallel assembly lines. These subassemblies were then brought together for final assembly, drastically reducing production time. From raw steel to a completed tank, the entire process took just 48 hours. By December 1942, the scale of production at Detroit was already outpacing German efforts. The Detroit Arsenal alone was producing 896 Shermans per month, more than double the number that German intelligence believed was possible. Across the United States, multiple factories had adopted the same production model, including Fisher Body's Grand Blanc Tank Arsenal, producing 385 tanks per month, Lima Locomotive Works with 165 tanks monthly, Pressed Steel Car Company with 320 tanks per month, Pacific Car and Foundry with 280 tanks per month, Federal Machine and Welder with 240 tanks per month, American Locomotive Company with 310 tanks per month, Baldwin Locomotive Works with 205 tanks per month, Pullman Standard Car Company with 385 tanks per month, Montreal Locomotive Works in Canada with 180 tanks monthly, Angus Shops in Canada with 145 tanks per month. By the end of 1942, these combined efforts resulted in an estimated total of 3,500 Sherman tanks produced every month. In contrast, the Germans were only able to produce 34 Tigers per month during the same period. This disparity was reflected in the ratio of production, 103 American tanks for every one German tank. In January 1943, the German Inspector General of Panzer Forces, General Heinz Guderian, was presented with these intelligence figures. His response, documented in his personal diary, was grim and succinct. If these numbers are even half true, we have already lost the war.
This contrast in production strategies between the United States and Germany illustrated the crucial role that industrial output played in determining the outcome of World War II. While the Germans focused on quality and craftsmanship, the Americans focused on quantity, producing tanks faster and in greater numbers than their enemies ever anticipated. This shift in production philosophy became a key factor in the success of the Allied forces. The disparity in production between the American and German tank forces created a series of cascading effects that further reinforced the advantages the U.S. held over Nazi Germany. By 1943, the American production lines were turning out thousands of Sherman tanks, which allowed for extensive and effective training for tank crews. At Fort Knox, Kentucky, the Armored Force School received hundreds of Shermans, all designated specifically for training purposes. Crews underwent rigorous, hands-on instruction that lasted 12 weeks, covering every aspect of the tank's operation. They honed their skills with thousands of rounds fired in gunnery drills, and they logged hundreds of miles behind the wheel. Beyond just driving and shooting, crews were trained in the maintenance of their vehicles, performing repairs and replacements until they could do so with their eyes closed. One soldier, Private First Class Clarence Smooyer, recalled his time at Fort Knox in 1943, describing how the training process involved pushing the Shermans to their limits. "We wore those training tanks out," he said. "We drove them until they broke down, fixed them, and then drove them again. By the time we shipped out, I knew that tank better than my family's farm tractor. I could identify every noise it made, know exactly what it meant, and which tool to use for any job." By contrast, German Tiger tank training was far more limited due to the scarcity of Tigers. At its peak, Germany produced just over 100 Tigers per month, and training vehicles were extremely rare. At Putlos, a German tank training center, only 4 Tigers were available for training. The soldiers assigned to train on these tanks had minimal time in actual vehicles. A panzer trooper, Kurt Klein, who was stationed with the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion, described his training as a far cry from the American approach. "We spent only 3 days in an actual Tiger tank," he said. "The rest of the time was spent studying diagrams and sitting in wooden mock-ups. By the time we arrived in Russia with our company Tigers, half the crew had never even started the engine." Compounding the difficulty for German crews was the complexity of the Tiger tank itself. While the Sherman contained about 15,000 parts and required 50 specialized tools for field maintenance, the Tiger was a much more intricate machine with 26,000 components and a demand for 230 specialized tools. This made the maintenance of the Tiger far more difficult and time-consuming. American crews could achieve basic operational competence in about 4 weeks, while German Tiger crews needed up to 3 months to become proficient, time that the Wehrmacht simply could not afford during the war. When the Allies landed on D-Day, June 6, 1944, the overwhelming scale of American tank production would become glaringly evident. The Allies had 4,000 tanks, mostly Shermans, with another 8,000 on standby in England awaiting deployment. Germany, on the other hand, could muster just 1,347 Tigers, of which only about 430 were operational at any given time across all fronts. On the beaches of Normandy, the Germans had only 102 Tigers available to defend against the invasion. On June 7, 1944, an SS Panzer commander, describing the combat near Carentan, said, "We destroyed 8 Shermans in the morning. By afternoon, 16 more appeared in their place. We destroyed 6 more. By evening, fresh companies kept arriving. They came like ants. You could step on dozens, even hundreds." The rapid replacement of American tanks was a testament to the logistical efficiency the Allies had established. While the Germans had difficulty maintaining and replacing their tanks, the Americans had developed an effective system for keeping their forces well equipped. Colonel Joseph Gillam, who oversaw the American tank logistics, managed a reserve of over 2,300 Shermans stored in British depots. Damaged tanks were either quickly repaired by mobile workshops or replaced entirely from stockpiles. Within 48 hours, a lost Sherman could be replaced, ensuring that tank units were rarely left without enough vehicles to continue the fight. In contrast, the Germans struggled to replace a single Tiger tank. Each Tiger required special railway transport, and the journey from Germany to Normandy took at least 5 days under ideal conditions. Allied airstrats often extended this to weeks. Of the 45 Tigers sent to Normandy in June 1944, only 17 arrived in operational condition. One of the most famous engagements of the war, Michael Wittmann's attack at Villers-Bocage on June 13, 1944, has been touted as a high point for German tank warfare. Wittmann and his Tigers destroyed 14 British tanks, 15 armored personnel carriers, and 2 anti-tank guns in a matter of minutes. Although some historians debate whether all of these kills were made by Wittmann personally or were shared with his unit, German propaganda at the time claimed it was proof of the invincibility of the Tiger and the superiority of the Aryan race. However, what was often overlooked was the aftermath of the attack. Within 72 hours, the British 7th Armored Division had fully replaced all the tanks they had lost. Wittmann's Tiger Company, on the other hand, suffered heavy losses, and it would take 6 weeks before any replacements could be delivered. Lieutenant Colonel John Cloudsley Thompson of the 7th Armored Division later reflected on the disparity between the two forces. Wittmann was undoubtedly brilliant, but brilliance is a finite resource. He could destroy our tanks faster than we could make tea, but we could replace them faster than he could reload his gun. The reality of industrial production, especially when combined with the Allies' superior logistical capabilities, ultimately proved to be a decisive factor in the defeat of the German tank forces during World War II. Despite the technological advantages of tanks like the Tiger, the relentless flow of replacements and reinforcements allowed the Allies to outlast and ultimately overwhelm the German armored units. This imbalance would play a key role in the collapse of Nazi Germany's armored divisions as the war dragged on. The sheer scale of logistical support required for the operation of tanks during World War II extends beyond simple production numbers. The American Sherman tank, for instance, demanded a supply chain capable of delivering 150 gallons of fuel every 100 meters of movement, along with 104 rounds of ammunition, enough oil and lubricants for 30 gallons, spare track blocks, road wheels, filters, and various provisions for the 5-member crew. This logistical effort was managed without failure by the American supply system, most notably through the Red Bull Express, a vital supply route that ran between the Normandy beaches and the front lines from August to November of 1944. Operating 6,000 trucks on continuous runs, this supply network moved massive quantities of materials. On August 29, 1944 alone, the Red Bull Express delivered 12,342 tons of supplies, which included 800,000 gallons of fuel, 3,000 tons of ammunition, and rations sufficient for 28 divisions. This ability to maintain a constant flow of resources was critical to the American war effort. In stark contrast, the German Tiger tank presented an entirely different set of logistical challenges. Each Tiger required 650 gallons of fuel every 60 miles, along with 92 rounds of ammunition, 100 gallons of oil, specialized spare parts that were exclusively manufactured in Germany, and high-quality fuel that became progressively harder to obtain as the war dragged on. The German supply system, unlike the Americans, faced severe constraints. For example, a single Tiger battalion required 40,000 gallons of fuel for a mere 100 miles of movement, more than the fuel reserves at most German depots could accommodate. The engine powering the Tiger, the Maybach HL-230 P45, was highly powerful, but required high-octane fuel, a resource Germany struggled to produce in the quantities needed. By the end of 1944, Tiger units often found themselves immobilized, not by enemy action, but by empty fuel tanks. In one particularly telling report from August 1944, Hauptmann Wolfgang Schlick of Schwere Panzer Abteilung 506 recounted, "We have 6 operational Tigers, but only enough fuel for 30 kilometers. The Americans pass our positions in endless columns. We dare not engage. We could destroy a dozen or even 24 tanks, but soon we would be overrun by the hundreds following them, leaving us helpless." In terms of maintenance, the Sherman tank was designed to be repaired by relatively inexperienced personnel. Even conscripts with basic training could replace the entire transmission in just 4 hours, swap out tracks in 90 minutes, and replace the engine in 6 hours. Every component of the Sherman was designed to be easily accessed and replaceable, without needing to disassemble other parts. This simplicity of design made the Sherman highly adaptable in the field, a point underscored by Technical Sergeant Robert Early, the maintenance chief for the 3rd Armored Division. The Sherman was like a farm tractor with armor. Any kid who'd worked on his dad's John Deere could figure it out. If something broke, we'd unbolt it and bolt on a new one. We'd have a knocked-out Sherman back in action before the Germans even figured out what was wrong with their Tiger. In contrast, the Tiger's maintenance was a highly complex and time-consuming process. The tank's interleaved wheel system, while effective for weight distribution, required the removal of up to 9 wheels to replace a single damaged inner wheel, a task that could take up to 12 hours under the best conditions. The Tiger's transmission, while a remarkable feat of engineering with 8 forward gears, necessitated specialized tools and expert mechanics for any significant repairs. The temperamental Maybach engine was another constant challenge, requiring regular adjustments to maintain its performance. A mechanic from the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion, Hans Bauer, recounted a particularly dire situation in Russia. He recalled, "We had a Tiger with a broken transmission. The replacement part had to come from Germany, and it took 3 weeks to arrive. Installing it required removing the turret, and we needed a 15-ton crane to do the job, but no crane was available, and so the Tiger sat idle for 2 months while Shermans passed us by every day."
By mid-1944, Germany's production system had created a cascading crisis that could not be rectified. The German army faced an increasing shortage of qualified crews for its Tigers. Each tank required 5 highly trained specialists, a commander who had undergone at least 6 months of training, a gunner with 4 months of specialized instruction, a loader trained for 2 months, a driver experienced with heavy tanks for 4 months, and a radio operator hull gunner trained for 3 months. A complete Tiger crew therefore required 19 months of training to be properly equipped for combat. However, Germany was losing Tiger crews faster than they could train replacements. The loss of Tiger 007 near St. Lo on August 8, 1944, which included the death of the famed commander Michael Wittmann and his crew, represented a catastrophic blow to Germany's war effort. With their deaths, Germany lost not just the tank, but over 60 man-months of irreplaceable training and combat experience, a loss that was nearly impossible to recover from in the dwindling resources and personnel of late 1944. By 1944, the United States was not grappling with the same challenges as its adversaries. Fort Knox, a key training facility, was churning out around 2,000 fully prepared Sherman tank crews each month. This consistency in training was partly due to the standardization of the Sherman model, meaning any crew could operate any tank without difficulty. If a crew member was wounded or killed, a replacement could be swiftly integrated into the team, drawing from a pool of 10,000 trained tank operators stationed in England, all of whom were familiar with the Sherman's mechanics and controls. One such crew member, Staff Sergeant Lafayette P., who commanded a Sherman tank named In the Mood, recalled the American advantage. "We lost our loader at St. Lo. Within 2 hours, we had a replacement who was already trained on the exact same model," he explained. "He knew the ammunition racks, all the controls, everything. We didn't skip a beat." The efficiency and flexibility of the American system were apparent. While the Battle of Normandy had already proven the improbability of German victory, the vast Soviet counteroffensive on the Eastern Front in 1944 highlighted the futility of continued German resistance. On June 22, 1944, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, which coincidentally marked the 3rd anniversary of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. This operation alone saw the Soviets fielding an overwhelming number of tanks, 4,080, against a much smaller German force of just 495 tanks, including a mere 29 operational Tigers. A crucial factor in the Soviets' success was their adoption of American industrial techniques. The Soviet T-34, although not as refined as the German Tiger, could be produced in significantly larger numbers. Manufacturing a T-34 only required 3,000 man-hours, while the Tiger's production demanded an astounding 300,000 man-hours. By mid-1944, Soviet factories were turning out 2,000 T-34 tanks per month. The Germans, on the contrary, were finding it nearly impossible to keep up. The Soviet strategy was simple but effective. For every 3 tanks destroyed, 5 more were produced. German tank commander Ernst Lindermann of Panzerabteilung 505 documented this grim reality, noting the exponential increase in Soviet tank numbers. "On July 5th, we destroyed 16 T-34s near Minsk. The next day, 22 more appeared. On July 7th, we destroyed 19, and by July 8th, 60 new T-34s attacked. We only had 2 Tigers operational. We had to retreat."
In this context, the Soviet adoption of mass production techniques, akin to the American approach, proved devastating for the Germans. The phrase, "quantity has a quality all its own," proved eerily accurate. The Soviets also benefited from the American Lend-Lease program, which provided them with 4,112 Shermans, more than 3 times the total number of German Tigers ever produced. The experience of the Italian campaign, where the confined terrain often forced close-range engagements, gave German tank crews a clear view of American industrial superiority. In these battles, the advantages of the Tiger tank were often nullified, as its strengths were most apparent in more open terrain. More importantly, German crews began to observe the incredible speed at which American tanks were being replaced. At the Battle of Monte Cassino, German tank commander Friedrich Bufuscher of Panzerabteilung 508 kept a detailed log of the growing number of Shermans appearing on the battlefield. On February 15th, he recorded destroying 4 Shermans. The very next day, he noted that 8 more Shermans appeared in the same location, and by February 17th, he was facing 12 Shermans. By February 18th, there were 22 Shermans in the field. Buscher's log highlighted the staggering rate of American tank replacement. "We have 4 Tigers operational and only 12 rounds per tank remaining." His despair was shared by many others. German soldier Helmut Wagner wrote to his wife, describing the sense of futility. "It's like we are Sisyphus pushing the boulder. Every Sherman we destroy, 2 more take its place. It's like a farmer harvesting wheat, but the field regrows overnight." The rapid recovery and repair of damaged American tanks further contributed to the German sense of helplessness. The 16th Armored Recovery Battalion was exceptionally efficient at retrieving and repairing tanks. Captain Thomas Roberts, who served with this unit, described their operations. "We'd hook a Sherman that caught fire in the morning, have it back at the depot by noon, repaired by evening, and back in action the next morning." For the Germans, a tank that was marked as destroyed might reappear days later, often before they had a chance to replenish their own forces. At Detroit Tank Arsenal, the American workers who contributed to this industrial machine were acutely aware of the stakes. Above the assembly lines, a banner read, "Every tank we build is a life saved." This mantra was not just a slogan, it was a clear reminder of the direct impact their work had on the battlefield. As the war raged on, this unrelenting production and repair cycle made victory increasingly difficult for the Germans to envision. The sheer scale and speed of American industrial output, paired with the strategic use of mass production by both the Soviets and the Americans, played a decisive role in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. Mary Kriftinsky, a Polish immigrant employed at Detroit Arsenal during World War II, exemplified the unwavering resolve of American wartime production. She recalled the significance of her work, particularly the Sherman tanks she welded, knowing that any one of them might be the very one to bring her brother, who was stationed with the 1st Armored Division in Italy, safely home. During the intense days surrounding the invasion of Sicily, workers endured grueling 16-hour shifts, but none complained. The assembly line never faltered. The factory operated without interruption, running 3 full shifts a day, 7 days a week, and 365 days a year. By Christmas 1943, voluntary overtime reached an astounding 95%. Absenteeism was remarkably low, less than 2%, which stood in stark contrast to German factories, where absenteeism had climbed to a staggering 15% by late 1944. When workers called in sick, their colleagues often visited them to offer assistance, reinforcing a sense of solidarity and dedication to the cause.
In stark contrast, German manufacturing facilities faced far harsher circumstances. Allied bombings were a constant threat, frequently halting production. The Henschel factory, a key producer of the Tiger tank, endured 39 air raids between October 1943 and March 1945, each one disrupting tank production for days or weeks at a time. Meanwhile, skilled workers were increasingly conscripted into military service, leaving factories with fewer trained hands. By late 1944, the factories were heavily reliant on forced labor, which comprised nearly 40% of the workforce. This system required guards and undermined productivity, as many of the workers sabotaged their tasks. According to Friedrich Müller, a German factory inspector, the situation had become untenable by November 1944. "At Castle Factory," he reported, "we produced 8 Tigers this month. 8. The Americans produce as many in 4 hours. Our labor force consists largely of slaves who disrupt production, while their workers are free and motivated, working tirelessly to build more. In this equation, we cannot prevail." Another key advantage for American forces lay in fuel. The Sherman tank, unlike the German Tiger, could run on regular gasoline, anywhere between 70 and 85 octane, and could operate on a variety of fuels in emergencies, including aviation fuel. The radial aircraft engine, employed in the Sherman, was highly reliable and forgiving. In contrast, the Germans relied on the Maybach engine in their Tigers, which required premium-grade fuel with a minimum of 87 octane. German fuel, primarily produced through coal liquefaction at synthetic fuel plants, was inferior and often damaged their engines. By late 1944, fuel shortages were so severe in Germany that training for Tiger crews was severely impacted. New crews would often arrive at the front lines without ever having operated their tanks in practice. The difference in fuel consumption between the two tanks was vast. A Tiger consumed 2.75 gallons per mile on paved roads and 5.5 gallons per mile when driving off-road, whereas a Sherman used just 0.5 gallons per mile on roads and 1.2 gallons cross-country. For a Tiger company to cover 100 meters, it required 15,000 gallons of fuel. A Sherman company needed only 3,000 gallons for the same distance. One German commander, Oberst von Westenhagen of the SS Panzer Division, described the impossible situation his forces faced during the Battle of the Bulge, which began on December 16, 1944. His report highlighted the fuel dilemma. My Tigers have fuel for perhaps 60 kilometers. Our objective lies 200 kilometers away. We're ordered to capture American fuel supplies. But how can we reach the American fuel without fuel of our own? This is madness born of desperation. The Battle of the Bulge, which occurred in December 1944, marked a clear turning point in the war. Hitler's final reserve of tanks, which included 69 precious King Tigers, was thrown into a desperate assault. The Germans were able to achieve initial successes, with the formidable King Tigers of the 501 SS Panzer Division destroying numerous Shermans at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. German propaganda hailed the performance of their tanks as evidence of German engineering superiority. However, the reality of industrial scale and the logistical challenges of the German military soon became evident.
Within days, the equation tipped in favor of the Allies. As German tanks ran low on fuel, American replacement tanks were already en route. For example, the 40 Shermans lost on December 17th were replaced by the 19th, and the 60 lost on December 18th were replaced by December 20th. By December 22nd, General George Patton's Third Army, operating in the South, had dispatched 350 new Shermans, rapidly replenishing the forces at the front. The sheer numbers of tanks available to the Allies proved overwhelming, and the Germans were unable to sustain their offensive. Despite the early success of their Tiger tanks, the Germans' reliance on premium fuel, skilled workers, and the supply chain disruptions caused by Allied bombings had ultimately undermined their ability to win the war. While the German propaganda machine attempted to spin the Battle of the Bulge as proof of superior German engineering, the hard math of numbers and logistics spelled the inevitable defeat of Nazi Germany. Within a span of 48 hours, despite suffering the loss of 88 tanks to German artillery, Patton's forces had managed to field 400 operational Shermans. The losses were quickly outpaced by the incoming replacements. Meanwhile, German forces had run into severe logistical issues. SS General Piper, unable to secure fuel, had been forced to abandon his Tigers, eventually destroying them to prevent capture. On March 6, 1945, the world witnessed one of the most iconic tank battles of the war, a clash between an American Pershing and a German Panther near the Cologne Cathedral. While this confrontation captured the cameras, a more significant and telling scene played out just 500 meters away. There, 11 Shermans, destroyed by a single Panther over a 2-day span, lay in ruins around the cathedral square. But by the following day, 15 replacement Shermans were already stationed there. The Panther, having suffered damage and exhausted its ammunition, was eventually abandoned by its crew. This scene encapsulated the tactical situation of the war. The Germans managed local victories through their superior technology, but the Americans, through sheer numbers, won the war. This pattern repeated itself across the German heartland, where individual tactical successes by the German forces often became irrelevant in the face of overwhelming American industrial output and manpower. Feldwebel Gustav Schreiber, a Panther gunner, later reflected on the German predicament. His unit destroyed 258 enemy tanks, the majority of them Shermans. Despite this impressive tally, the Americans quickly replaced their losses. "We lost 12 Panthers and received only 2 replacements in 6 months," Schreiber recalled. For every tactical success the Germans enjoyed, the strategic defeat loomed closer. The disparity in resources became increasingly evident, not just in equipment, but in personnel. The difference between the American and German tank forces was stark. By the end of the war, the U.S. had trained over 250,000 tank crews. In comparison, Germany trained only about 40,000 personnel for its Panthers and Tigers. When an American tank crew was lost, it was quickly replaced by one of the many trained reserves waiting in the depots. Conversely, the loss of a German Tiger crew meant the end of that unit's expertise. There was no replacement for their experience.
Sergeant Joe Saunders of the 2nd Armored Division explained the American advantage in simple terms. We knew that if our tank was knocked out, there were 50 more waiting for us. We could bail out, walk back, and get another tank. The Germans knew that if they lost a Tiger, it was irreplaceable. This understanding, the knowledge that the Americans could afford losses while the Germans could not, was a key factor in the psychological warfare of the conflict. As the war progressed, this advantage grew even more pronounced. By March 1945, American tank crews had, on average, 6 months of training before they entered combat, compared to the German Tiger crews, who only had about 2 weeks of training. Many of these crews were very young, some barely out of their teens, and had limited exposure to their machines. As one German tank driver, Wilhelm Hoffmann, later recounted, "I had driven a truck in the Hitler Youth. They gave me 4 days on a Panzer IV, then put me in a King Tiger." Meanwhile, the American tankers were facing off against these poorly trained crews with far more experience, having spent much more time in their tanks and in combat.
The technological contrast between the two sides was striking. German tanks, like the Tiger and Panther, were engineering marvels. Their 88mm guns were capable of destroying any Allied tank at distances of up to 2,000 meters, and their armor could withstand most Allied shells. The interleaved road wheels provided a sophisticated suspension system that spread the vehicle's weight evenly. These machines were, in many ways, masterpieces of military engineering. However, their complexity came with a major drawback. Production was slow, and their maintenance was costly and time-consuming. In contrast, the American M4 Sherman was not a technological marvel, but it was efficient and reliable. The Sherman's 75mm gun could struggle against the heavier German tanks, and its armor was less robust, but it was good enough. The simple design and mass production methods meant that the U.S. could build 36 Shermans for the cost of a single Tiger. The American philosophy of tank production was summed up by William Knudsen, an observer of Sherman production in 1943. He stated, "The best tank is not the one that's technically superior, it's the one that's there when you need it. A Sherman in France is worth 10 perfect tanks on a drawing board." This philosophy, combined with the ability to quickly train and replace crews, proved decisive in the later stages of the war. While the Germans pursued a policy of engineering excellence, the Americans focused on mass production and fielding tanks quickly. The result was a strategy that may not have been focused on perfection, but was centered on availability and reliability in the face of overwhelming numbers. And in the end, it was the Americans' ability to continually produce tanks and replace losses that would prove to be the key to victory. Albert Speer, the German Minister of Armaments during World War II, came to realize too late the consequences of his focus on perfection in military technology. In his memoirs published in 1969, he confessed that the pursuit of increasingly advanced designs led to a stagnation in production. Every upgrade demanded new tooling and redesign, which delayed output. Meanwhile, the American war effort relied on a different approach. By prioritizing quantity over complexity, the U.S. produced vast numbers of the same basic tank model. The result was a victory achieved through the simplicity of arithmetic rather than engineering sophistication. The M4 Sherman, the backbone of the U.S. tank fleet, maintained an exceptional operational readiness rate with up to 90% of the tanks in a unit typically operational on any given day. This high level of reliability came from the Sherman's simple design, which, while less advanced than its German counterparts, was robust, durable, and easy to repair. Mechanical failures were infrequent, and when they did occur, spare parts were readily available and the tank crews were well trained to perform quick repairs. In stark contrast, the German Tiger tank, which was far more complex, could not sustain such efficiency. By late 1944, only 35% of the Tigers in service were operational. If a unit managed to have 100 Tigers, only about 35 would be functioning on any given day due to frequent breakdowns. The advanced technology of the Tiger, such as its sophisticated transmission system, often failed after minimal use, with some parts requiring replacement after just 500 meters of travel. Furthermore, the interleaved road wheels designed to support the tank in rough terrain collected mud which froze in the harsh Russian winters, rendering the tank immobile until it was manually cleared.
Major Hans Kruger, the maintenance officer of the 503rd Heavy Tank Battalion, documented the German predicament in January 1945. Out of 45 Tigers in his battalion, only 11 were operational. The rest were out of action due to a range of problems. 8 needed new transmissions, 6 required engine replacements, 12 needed repairs to their tracks, and 8 had multiple other failures. To keep one tank operational, 3 others were cannibalized for parts. Meanwhile, the American military adopted a different strategy. If a Sherman was damaged beyond repair, it was simply abandoned, and a new one would replace it. By the time 1945 rolled around, U.S. production was far more advanced, and they had created an operational flexibility that the Germans could never match. U.S. commanders could plan operations with confidence, knowing that tank losses would be replaced rapidly, allowing them to make tactical exchanges of tanks for territory. In contrast, German commanders were constantly calculating the risks of each operation, as the loss of even a single Tiger tank had serious long-term consequences due to their low production rates and high maintenance needs. General Omar Bradley, reflecting on the disparity, explained the strategic advantage the Americans held. "We knew we would lose 4 Shermans for every Tiger we destroyed, but we also knew that for every Tiger they had, we had 10 Shermans. The mathematics were straightforward. We could afford to trade tanks for objectives. They couldn't." By March 1945, German tank units were under strict orders not to engage unless absolutely necessary, as the loss of any Tiger tank was too costly to bear. The severity of the German predicament was highlighted by General Major Wolfgang Lang, who commanded a division on the Eastern Front. He explained the desperate situation in his sector. "I had 8 Tigers and 900 Shermans. If I revealed the positions of my Tigers, they would be destroyed by artillery and air attacks. If I didn't use them, the Shermans would overrun us. We were reduced to watching our destruction through periscopes." By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the stark contrast in production figures underscored the true nature of the war. The Germans had produced a total of approximately 1,839 Tiger tanks between 1942 and 1945, including both the Tiger I and the more advanced Tiger II King Tiger. In comparison, the United States had produced over 49,000 M4 Sherman tanks, with additional production by British and Canadian factories bringing the total to over 51,000. This meant that for every Tiger produced, the Allies fielded roughly 27 Shermans. However, the numbers alone don't tell the full story. By May 1945, fewer than 20 Tigers were operational with the Wehrmacht, while around 35,000 Shermans were still operational worldwide. In terms of trained crewmen, the Germans had fewer than 200 fully trained Tiger crewmen available, while the Americans had over 40,000 trained Sherman crews available. A reunion of American and German tank veterans in 1975 at Fort Knox revealed just how critical the production math was to both sides' experiences. Otto Karius, Germany's second highest scoring tank ace with over 150 kills, candidly shared his perspective. "We were fighting against arithmetic, not Americans. I could destroy 10 Shermans, but for every one I destroyed, 20 more would appear. It wasn't combat, it was mathematics. We were like calculators trying to stop an avalanche with individual excellence."
This simple yet powerful truth about the scale of production and its operational consequences ultimately shaped the outcome of the war. The Germans had invested heavily in engineering and technology, but in the end, the Allies won through sheer numbers, adaptability, and the efficiency of mass production. During World War II, American and German tank crews faced contrasting realities that were shaped by vastly different resources, strategies, and industrial capabilities. Staff Sergeant Clyde Brunson, a seasoned veteran who commanded Sherman tanks in 3 armored divisions, had endured the loss of 2 Shermans under his command, yet his insights reflected the fundamental advantage that the Allies had. He said, "Otto's right. We weren't tank aces, but that didn't matter. What we needed was to be enough in numbers. Wars aren't won by heroic individuals, but by production lines." A former German officer, Hans von Luck, who had served in the Wehrmacht, captured the essence of the German experience when he asked the American veterans, Did you know your sheer numbers would overwhelm us no matter how skilled we were?" Sergeant Ray Hopkins responded, "Yes, we knew. Everywhere we went, we passed depots with hundreds of new Shermans. Letters from home spoke about factories running 24/7. We were fighting your entire industrial machine, not just your soldiers. We almost felt sorry for you." The sheer volume of American tank production became a defining factor in the war. The Sherman tank, which was produced in vast numbers, was a symbol of this overwhelming industrial might. America's ability to churn out specialized tank variants at an unprecedented rate also played a crucial role in the Allies' success. Among the many adaptations were the Sherman Firefly with the powerful British 17-pounder gun, the heavily armored Sherman Jumbo, the rocket-launching Sherman Calliope, the mine-clearing Sherman Crab, and the amphibious Sherman DD. In contrast, Germany struggled to keep pace. The German Tiger tank, once regarded as the epitome of armored warfare, could barely be produced in sufficient numbers, let alone in the form of specialized variants. The Sturm Tiger, for instance, was an adaptation that converted Tigers into assault guns. Only 18 of these tanks were made, and this diversion of resources proved to be a costly mistake. The disparity in logistical support was another factor that severely hindered Germany's war effort. While American supply depots were stocked with tens of thousands of spare parts, ensuring that any required component could be delivered within 72 hours, the German system was plagued by shortages. Tiger units often waited months for critical replacement parts. German crews would often cannibalize operational tanks in an attempt to keep others running, a practice that further weakened their ability to maintain battlefield readiness. Technical Sergeant Mike Kozlowski, who worked at a forward depot in Belgium, offered a vivid description of the American logistical advantage. He said, "We had warehouses packed with everything: engines, transmissions, tracks, guns. A unit would call for parts, and we'd load them up and send them off. I threw away more spare parts because there was no room to store them than German units ever received."
The American tank crews, well aware of the abundance of replacement tanks and supplies, adopted a more cautious approach to combat. Private First Class Clarence Smoyer recalled the instructions given to his unit. "Our lieutenant told us plainly, your job is to survive and keep pushing forward. If you see a Tiger, call in artillery or air support. Don't try to be heroes. Heroes don't last. We have more tanks than we have men. Stay alive, and we'll keep you in the fight." This mindset was driven by the knowledge that replacements were always available. Survival was more important than heroism. The German tank crews, on the other hand, faced the exact opposite conditions. Their Tigers were rare, and each tank was a precious asset. They carried a heavy psychological burden, knowing that the survival of their tank, and often their entire unit, depended on their ability to destroy numerous enemy tanks. Feldwebel Karl Braumann, a gunner in the Schreepanzer of the 52nd Tiger Battalion, reflected on this pressure. "We knew we had to kill 10, 20, 30 enemy tanks just to justify our Tiger's existence. It was unbearable. We were not soldiers anymore. We were accountants, calculating how many kills we needed to justify the cost of the tank and the crew." The contrast between American and German industrial capacity was stark. While American factories, shielded from enemy bombing and operating at full capacity, produced tanks without significant interruptions, Germany's war industry was under constant assault. Cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh churned out tanks and other war materials around the clock. Workers in these factories were well-fed, well-rested, and motivated, ensuring the high quality of the finished products.
In Germany, however, the constant threat of Allied bombings took its toll. The Henschel Works in Kassel, which produced the Tiger tanks, was bombed 39 times. The MAN factory in Nuremberg, another key producer, was hit 27 times. Workers were forced to spend nights in air raid shelters, and their days were spent clearing rubble from bombed-out buildings. Railroads were regularly severed by bombings, causing delays in the delivery of critical materials. The workforce, increasingly made up of exhausted German civilians and forced laborers, struggled with declining morale and diminished productivity. As a result, quality control suffered, and the production of key components slowed drastically. In the end, the sheer scale of American industrial production, paired with the Allies' ability to field an overwhelming number of tanks, was a decisive factor in the war. The ability to replace losses quickly, produce specialized tanks for different combat situations, and maintain a steady flow of parts and equipment gave the Allies a significant advantage over the Germans, whose war effort was undermined by resource scarcity, constant bombings, and the heavy psychological burden placed on their tank crews. In October of 1944, Hans Müller, the production manager at Heinel, outlined the growing array of problems plaguing the German war machine. A bombing raid the night before had crippled the heat treatment facility, an essential part of the production process for the armor plates of Tiger tanks. Due to this, the only way to proceed was to ship the steel plates to Essen, assuming trains could run. However, Essen had been bombed earlier that week, on Tuesday. The alternative was to send the plates to Dortmund, but that city had also been hit by Allied bombers just 2 days later. As it stood, Heinel had 200 Tiger hulls waiting for armor, but it was uncertain if even 20 of them would be completed that month. On the other side of the conflict, American tank production was far less disrupted. In Grand Blanc, Michigan, the Fisher tank arsenal employed 4,500 workers who were safe from the constant threat of bombing. These workers enjoyed stable working conditions, regular shifts, comfortable housing, and easy access to food and services. Their families lived in nearby communities with stocked stores and functional schools. This relative stability allowed the U.S. to maximize its production output, benefiting from the advantages of mass production. Unlike the Germans, who were struggling with dwindling resources, American factories experienced steady improvements in efficiency. For every 1,000 Shermans produced, the cost of each tank decreased by 8%. Continuous production improvements were implemented across all American facilities, resulting in a 60% faster production rate in 1944 compared to 1942, all while employing fewer workers.
Lieutenant Colonel Robert Young, analyzing the American production process, found that worker-driven innovations further boosted productivity. One notable suggestion came from a woman who noticed a slight adjustment to the welding sequence that saved 4 minutes per tank. When applied across the production line, this minor change saved 3,300 production hours every month, which was enough to build an additional 40 tanks. By contrast, German production efficiency was in steady decline. As skilled workers were conscripted into military service, the quality of production suffered. The scarcity of raw materials led to frequent substitutions, further complicating the production process. Moreover, the German factory system was increasingly fragmented as Allied bombing raids forced operations to shift to smaller, less efficient facilities. By the fall of 1944, the time it took to build a Tiger tank had ballooned from 300,000 man-hours in 1942 to 450,000 man-hours. As the war dragged on, each Tiger tank became more expensive and took longer to complete, a trend that stood in stark contrast to the efficiency gains seen in American production. While the German Tiger tanks had undeniable technological superiority, the complexity of their design created significant logistical challenges. The Maybach engine, for example, required 120 distinct parts that were unique to the Tiger. The tank's transmission necessitated specialized tools, and the gun's precision demanded constant maintenance. Every technological advantage came with an associated cost in terms of complexity. The Sherman tank, by comparison, benefited from simplicity.
Its Ford GAA engine shared parts with truck engines. Its transmission was a modified truck design, and its gun was adapted from an anti-aircraft weapon. These features made the Sherman both reliable and easily repairable, using parts that could be found in virtually any motor pool. Master Sergeant Tom Williams, who maintained Shermans with the 4th Armored Division, noted that Shermans could be repaired with parts scavenged from trucks, jeeps, or anything else available. If we needed a fuel pump, a truck pump would work. For electrical parts, a Jeep alternator would fit, he explained. The Tiger, on the other hand, required precise parts from specific factories. We didn't have the luxury of exact parts, just whatever worked. The scale of American tank production also became a psychological weapon. Captured German tank crews were shown large parks filled with hundreds of new Shermans, reinforcing the perception that the Allies could replace their tanks with ease. These crews were also taken to repair depots, where they saw tanks being repaired in a matter of hours. The sight of material being casually wasted with no apparent limits on resources sent a powerful message about the scale of American industrial might. Friedrich Schultz, a German tank crew member captured near Aachen after his Tiger was destroyed, recalled the experience of touring a U.S. tank depot. They showed us 500 new Shermans waiting for crews. The American officers said they received 500 a month just for this sector, Schultz later reported. At that moment, I realized that every Tiger we had destroyed was meaningless. We were just bailing water with a spoon. These reports from captured German soldiers, spreading word of the vast American industrial capacity, dealt a severe blow to German morale. Unlike Allied propaganda, these first-hand accounts were seen as credible and deeply demoralizing to German tank crews who were struggling to maintain their tanks with dwindling resources. By the winter of 1944-1945, the operational capabilities of American and German tank units were worlds apart. American tank units maintained an impressive 90% operational rate despite the challenges of combat and harsh weather. In contrast, German Tiger battalions struggled to keep even a fraction of their tanks operational. A war diary entry from the 56th Heavy Tank Battalion, dated January 1945, illustrates the dire situation. Of 45 King Tigers in the unit, only 8 were operational, while 37 were waiting for repairs. 12 of these required new engines, but none were available. 15 needed new transmissions, with only 2 in stock. The rest required various components, none of which were available. In desperation, the unit resorted to cannibalizing other tanks to keep a minimum operational strength. Meanwhile, the 37th Tank Battalion of the U.S. 4th Armored Division reported a far different story. Of their 53 Shermans, 51 were operational, and only 2 were awaiting repair. New replacement tanks were readily available at the depot, and there were 15 crew replacements on hand, including 3 full crews. The contrast between these two units, one struggling to keep its Tigers running and the other capable of fielding fully operational tanks at all times, was a stark reflection of the broader disparity in industrial capacity and production efficiency between Germany and the United States. In April 1945, the fundamental principles of wartime industrial production were demonstrated in an ironic twist of fate. As American forces advanced through the Rhine, they left behind a vast number of damaged Sherman tanks. These tanks were often beyond repair, but given the sheer volume of replacements being produced, there was little incentive to fix them. On the other hand, German forces, increasingly deprived of their own armored vehicles, resorted to scavenging the abandoned American tanks, restoring them for their own use. This reversal of fortunes was especially striking, given that, at the war's outset, Nazi Germany had been confident in its technological superiority, only to find itself in the humiliating position of having to make use of the very tanks they had once disparaged as inferior. German tanks such as the Tiger, with their advanced but overly complex designs, suffered from mechanical failures and a chronic lack of fuel. In contrast, the more reliable, straightforward design of the Sherman allowed it to continue functioning even in the face of difficult conditions. As German forces desperately tried to salvage any operational vehicle, they were often left with few options other than the captured Sherman. One German officer, Oberst Wilhelm Müller, who was in charge of a makeshift defensive force near Nuremberg, described the sorry state of his command. "I have 3 Tigers, 1 operational, 8 Shermans we've repaired, 12 assault guns, and various wheeled vehicles. The American tanks are easier to maintain than our own. We are now fighting with American tanks." His words captured the irony of the situation. German forces were now relying on the very vehicles they had once considered inferior, using their enemies' tanks to fight back. The final days of the war saw an American victory not through dramatic tank clashes, but through the sheer weight of industrial production. While German tanks sat abandoned by the side of the road, out of fuel, spare parts, and operational crews, the American forces continued to advance with fresh, well-supplied columns. The once feared German Tigers, which had dominated earlier in the war, were left stranded in their final moments, while the Shermans, though less formidable individually, were continually replenished from the seemingly endless supply coming from the United States.
General Dwight Eisenhower, during his tour of the defeated Germany, reflected on the broader significance of this outcome. "We did not defeat the German tanks, we defeated their ability to produce them." His point was clear. The true power of the American war machine lay not in superior weaponry, but in its capacity for relentless, scalable production. For every Tiger tank that the Germans lost, it represented a strategic loss, while the Americans could replace each lost Sherman before the enemy even had time to count the damage. The numerical comparison between the 2 tanks only underscored this disparity. The production of a single Tiger tank required between 300,000 and 450,000 man-hours, while a Sherman could be built in just 17,000 to 48,000 man-hours, roughly 1 Tiger's production time, equaling that of 6 to 26 Shermans. The cost of a Tiger tank in 1945 was between 250,000 and 300,000 Reichsmarks, while a Sherman cost just 44,556 to 64,455 Reichsmarks, according to U.S. Army catalog prices from that time. The fuel consumption of the 2 vehicles further emphasized their differences. The Tiger consumed 2.75 gallons of fuel per mile on the road, whereas the Sherman consumed just 0.5 gallons per mile. This meant that the fuel consumption of 1 Tiger equaled that of 5.5 Shermans. Maintenance needs were also vastly different. The Tiger required 10 hours of maintenance for every hour of operation, while the Sherman needed only 1 hour of maintenance for every 10 hours in the field, meaning the maintenance requirements for 1 Tiger were equivalent to those of 100 Shermans. Similarly, the time required to train a Tiger crew was a minimum of 19 man-months, compared to just 5 man-months for a Sherman crew, making 1 Tiger crew's training time equivalent to that of 4 Sherman crews. After the war, both American and German military experts reached the same conclusion. The Tiger was arguably the best tank of the war in terms of individual performance, but the Sherman, though inferior in combat effectiveness, proved far more effective as part of a broader logistical and production system. Colonel Robert Cameron, in his official history of the U.S. Army, summed up the outcome succinctly. The Sherman succeeded not despite its mediocrity, but because of it. Its simplicity allowed it to be mass-produced, its reliability ensured continuous operations, and its standardization enabled immediate replacements. The Tiger, on the other hand, failed not despite its excellence, but because of it. Its complexity hindered mass production, its unreliability reduced operational readiness, and its uniqueness made it impossible to replace. General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, in his post-war analysis of Germany's defeat, expressed a more concise but equally poignant observation. The Tiger was a masterpiece of individual design,
but the Sherman was a masterpiece of mass production. In the end, it was not the superiority of one tank over the other in combat that determined the outcome of the war, but rather the ability to produce, replace, and sustain that made the difference. The Germans had built a war machine that could be defeated not by better weapons, but by better systems.
During World War II, the Allied forces faced the German Army's formidable Tiger tanks, which were considered some of the most advanced and deadly machines of the time. The Germans produced only 1,347 of these tanks, but their engineering excellence came at a heavy cost. The Sherman tank, by contrast, was mass-produced by the United States, with over 49,000 units built. These numbers, however, tell a deeper story about the nature of industrial warfare and the contrasting military philosophies that shaped the outcome of the war. The Tiger tank, with its powerful armament and heavy armor, was a technological marvel. Its crews, however, understood that their tanks were irreplaceable. As a result, many of them fought to the death rather than abandon their vehicles when damaged. Of the approximately 8,000 men who served on Tiger crews, only around 2,000 survived the war, resulting in a staggering casualty rate of 75%. This intense attachment to the machine was not due to pride, but because of the sheer difficulty in replacing these tanks, which were expensive and complex to manufacture. In contrast, the American tank crews who operated the Sherman faced a very different mentality. The United States understood that its industrial strength lay in the ability to mass-produce equipment at an extraordinary scale. Sherman crews were taught that tanks were expendable, but men were not. When a Sherman was damaged, it was often abandoned, and the crew would quickly move to another tank. Of the 250,000 Americans trained to operate tanks during the war, only about 6,500 were killed in combat, a casualty rate of just 2.6%. This policy of replacement and abundance allowed the American forces to maintain a high level of operational readiness and flexibility, even in the face of significant losses. The success of the United States in this industrial approach to warfare became evident in the sheer volume of tanks they could produce. A single Tiger might have been a formidable opponent in a one-on-one engagement, but the overwhelming numbers of Shermans, along with superior air and artillery support, proved to be more effective in the long run. As one American tank commander, Sergeant John Irwin, put it, "We were taught that tanks were expendable. Crews were not. Bail out fast, walk back, get another tank." This philosophy emphasized the strategic advantage of industrial capacity over the tactical superiority of individual machines. The contrast between the two approaches, German craftsmanship versus American industrial might, was clear. The Germans relied on a philosophy of perfection in their tanks, hoping that their superior technology would give them an edge on the battlefield. However, this focus on quality came at the expense of quantity. Germany could not afford to replace its Tigers at the scale needed to match the Allies' production capabilities. As Otto Carrerius, a former German tank commander, succinctly noted, "The Tiger was a masterpiece, but wars are not tournaments. The Sherman was a tool of industry, and industry won the war." Soviet strategy in the Cold War would reflect similar lessons. The USSR adopted mass production principles similar to those of the United States, and the T-54/55 tank, with over 100,000 units produced, became the most widely manufactured tank in history. The Soviet approach emphasized simplicity and reliability, a shift away from the complexities of German tanks. Meanwhile, Germany, recovering from its defeat, embraced the notion of practical sufficiency in the design of the post-war Leopard tank, which prioritized ease of maintenance and operational reliability over raw combat capabilities. At a reunion of World War II veterans in 1985 at Fort Knox, both American and German veterans shared their reflections on the Tiger versus Sherman debate. One German veteran, Friedrich Schultz, who had once commanded a Tiger, explained the German perspective. He acknowledged the technical brilliance of the Tiger, but also admitted that the industrial might of the Americans was ultimately decisive. "You came with good enough tanks and overwhelming numbers," he said. "We fought with excellence, you fought with arithmetic. In war, arithmetic always wins." The principle behind this arithmetic was simple: quantity. The German Tiger, a tank of extraordinary capabilities, could dominate on the battlefield. But the Allies, especially the United States, could produce tanks in such numbers that the sheer volume of Shermans on the battlefield negated the Tiger's advantages. The Germans fought with excellence, but the Americans fought with industrial strength. This imbalance between quality and quantity did not just shape tank warfare during World War II, it became a fundamental principle in military thinking for decades to come. The United States, through its industrial prowess, demonstrated that the key to victory was not just in having superior machines, but in the ability to produce and replace them faster than the enemy could destroy them. In the long run, the war was won not by better tanks, but by more tanks, not by tactical excellence, but by overwhelming industrial capacity. Today, the few surviving Tigers, now restored, are prized as rare historical artifacts, with each one fetching millions at auction. In stark contrast, Shermans are still found in operation in various parts of the world, a testament to their mass production and durability. This contrast remains clear at the Patton Museum in Fort Knox, where a Tiger Eye sits beside an M4 Sherman with a placard explaining the significance of the numbers. Tiger Eye, one of 1,347 produced. This tank destroyed an estimated 40 Allied vehicles. Sherman M4A3, one of 49,234 produced. Tanks of this type liberated Europe. The difference in production numbers, the staggering 49,234 Shermans versus the 1,347 Tigers, speaks volumes about the nature of industrial warfare. In the end, the Tiger represented the peak of German engineering, but the Sherman was the tank that won the war. The German focus on perfection, while admirable, could not compete with the American ability to produce and replace tanks at a scale that overwhelmed the enemy. The numbers, 49,234 to 1,347, remain the defining measure of victory in the war, and perhaps the clearest illustration of the power of industrial capacity in modern conflict.